Hello, everyone. Well, we're going to discuss the first 30 chapters that we were reading this week, this first week of Moby Dick, and there's a lot to cover in these 30 chapters. So, and I'm not going to be able to cover it all, but some of the stuff that you'll see possibly online. But I want to cover some of the important aspects of the first 30 chapters, and one of those is the characters, some of the characters that we are introduced to by Melville, and so we're going to talk about those and some other things too. So anyway, we're introduced to most of the major characters in the first 30 chapters. In the first, some of them right away, of course. Ishmael is the narrator of the novel. He's the one who tells the story, and so therefore he has a prominent role. And it doesn't take very many chapters before we run into another character, and some people would say he is a character, and that is Queequeg, the Southeast Island cannibal that ends up sharing a bed with Queequeg at the Spouter Inn. Later on we run into some of the other major characters are the mates of the Pequod, Starbuck and Stubb and Flask, the first, second, and third mates. And perhaps most importantly, in chapter 28 we come to Captain Ahab. Some people say, why does it take 28 chapters to get to the main character of the novel? We'll talk about that in another lecture as to why it took so long to get to Captain Ahab. But what we have in the first 27 chapters before we get to Ahab is sort of the introduction of Ishmael and the world of whaling and the world of Nantucket. And when Ahab comes on deck, it's like the hero coming on stage. Those are the major characters. We also run into several minor characters, and I just mentioned some of them here. Captain Peleg and Bildad, the owners of the Pequod, they are foils for each other, even though they're both Quakers. You'll notice that they have opposite temperaments. One is calm and collected, and the other one has a hot, fiery temper. We run into a curious pastor named Father Mapple, who gives a sermon in the Seaman's Bethel is the name of the church that Queequeg and Ishmael attend, a foreshadowing sermon on Jonah and the whale. Peter Coffin is our source of humor in some ways. The end scene that we see when there's the mix-up and Ishmael wakes up and finds out that he's going to be sharing the bed with a cannibal, a naked cannibal covered with tattoos, and the scene that ensues, the frantic havoc that ensues, is actually a classic scene from 18th century English literature. You can read many of the novels of the 18th century, and they have this humorous end scene. It's almost like it is a sort of like comedy relief, I guess you might say. And one of the other characters we meet in the first 30 chapters is Elijah. And Elijah is, of course, we know, it's even the title of the chapter is the prophet. And we see that, of course, he has warnings for Ishmael and Queequeg about signing on to go on the Pequod. And so in the first 30 chapters we run into a lot of major characters. And I want to talk about a few of the major ones a little more specifically here. And I want to talk about Ishmael. The first thing is to ask is, what do we know about him? What have we learned about Ishmael in the first 30 chapters? Well, we know that Ishmael may or may not be his first name. In fact, in the very first line of the novel, one of the most famous lines in American literature is, "Call me Ishmael." Now, there's been a lot of conjecture about that. Call me Ishmael does not say the same thing as my name is Ishmael or I am Ishmael. It's almost as if he's taking on an alias of some kind. And of course, if you look up the biblical reference to Ishmael, you'll see that there is a possible connection there. We also find out that he is broke. He tells us in the first couple of lines that he has no money and little or no money in his purse, and that he's bored. He also has nothing in particular to interest him on shore. He is depressed One of the most beautiful lines, I think, in the novel is, "Whenever I find myself growing grim about the mouth, whenever it is a damp, drizzly November in my soul." This is a man who is seriously depressed. And finally, we see something very different in him that you would not expect in the first chapter. By the time you get to the sixth or seventh chapter, you realize he's open to new experience. When the scene at the Spouter Inn finally settles down, he realizes that it may not be so bad spending the night and sharing a bed with a cannibal. In fact, he said, "What's all this fuss?" on page 36. "What's all this fuss I've been making about?" Thought I to myself, "The man's a human being just as I am. He has just as much reason to fear me as I had to be afraid of him." And then the line, "Better to sleep with a sober cannibal than a drunken Christian." This is a man who after the initial shock is willing to accept others and willing to accept new experiences. And we'll see, of course, that's going to play a big part in the novel. So we know quite a bit about Ishmael. He reveals himself throughout the first 30 chapters. There will be times when, after chapter 28, when Ahab comes on board, you'll even forget that Ishmael is part of the crew. Even though he's telling the story, he sort of retreats into the background. But the first 27 chapters really are Ishmael and Queequeg's chapters, where he reveals himself. The next one, is, of course, is Queequeg. And what do we know about Queequeg? Well, we know he's a pagan. We know he's a cannibal. The first thing we hear about him is he's out selling shrunken heads in Nantucket. We know what romantics called a noble savage. If you remember in the characteristics of Romanticism, they looked at the Native Americans and these pagan people as the noble savage. They were closer to nature than man, who's been corrupted by civilization. And so therefore, and he even comes, Queequeg even tells us he comes from nobility. He's an excellent harpooner. In fact, on the Pequod, your pay depends upon what you can do and how good you are at it. And even though Queequeg is a cannibal from the South Sea Islands, he gets a much higher pay or lay than Ishmael, who is an inexperienced seaman. And we also know that as the novel goes on, he becomes Ishmael's bosom friend. And they become they do become inseparable because they're on the Pequod together. So it's very interesting. We have, these two that come together. Both of them are open to new experience. Both of them are open to accepting others who are different than they are, which is, I think, quite telling. And of course, then the third one is Captain Ahab. And what do we know about Ahab? Well, he's a man of great reputation. We're going to take a look at this in just a minute. I have another small lecture on characteristics of a tragic hero. He is a man of great reputation. He lost his leg to a white whale named Moby Dick. He is reclusive. He retreats away. Even in the first several days on the Pequod, he doesn't show himself on deck. And he's both admired and feared by his crew, and we'll see how this plays out as the novel goes through. A man of great reputation. The first time we hear about him is when Bildad and Peleg are talking about him, and they talk about this great Captain Ahab. He's a man that in Nantucket would be considered one of the greatest captains, and so therefore he had a tremendous reputation about him. But then he had a run-in with Moby Dick and lost his leg in that confrontation, and it changed him as a man. In fact, he says it dismasted him. Dismasted is almost analogous to castration, to put it bluntly. This idea that he is now less a man because of Moby Dick, and of course we see as this goes on, he's a tormented, tortured soul, as we will see through the novel. So what we have here then is the introduction of all these characters, and we'll be talking about some other things in chapters 1 through 30 in other lectures. But all these characters that come into the scene and onto the stage. And I want to stop this lecture and do another one called the characteristics of a tragic hero, which will be the third lecture for this series.